One of the most popular combat boots in history is this jungle boot. Some people say it's the best combat boot there ever was. Some say it's the worst. But either way, there's a few things about the design of this boot that I bet you didn't know. So we're gonna cut it in half, show you how this whole thing happened, all the design features, and why people love and hate this boot. And thanks to Tactile Turn for sponsoring this video. They make some of the coolest pins in the entire world. They're all handmade and hand machined in Texas, and they make them out of a bunch of different materials. They have the copper like I have here. They use bronze, titanium, and zirconium, which I didn't even know you could make pins out of. They're really cool because they're really heavy because of how thick the sidewalls are on this, and they have a nice texture on them, and this bolt action is the most fidgety thing. And I have to like not hold it, or we'll be talking in meetings. I sit there and flip it back and forth. Everyone's banned with these in meetings because they're so fun to play with. And another cool thing is you can have them laser engraved, and because these are a premium pin, you can replace the cartridges with most of the popular pin cartridges out there. So if you have one you like, you just pop it in rather than wasting so many of those little cheap plastic pins, polluting the environment. And Tactile Turn stands behind all their craftsmanship because they have a lifetime warranty on them. So if it ever breaks, and the thing is I highly doubt they're ever gonna break because they're built so heavy duty. We'll put some footage in the background of how thick and how heavy duty these things are actually built. And they patina over time, especially the copper. So check them out via the link in my description, and thanks again to Tactile Turn for sponsoring this video. So I'm like fidgeting it, and I'm not even aware of fidgeting it in the ad. Sorry, thanks again, Tactile Turn. So what is the Jungle Boot? Well, the Jungle Boot was designed based on the improvements from the World War II boot that we cut apart last year, with the concept of the boot being, the design of the Jungle Boot was based on the idea that no boot could possibly keep water out and still provide sufficient ventilation to the feet in a jungle or swamp environment. Instead, the Jungle Boot was designed to permit water and perspiration to drying the feet while preventing entry of insects, mud, or sand, and most importantly, to prevent jungle rot or trench foot, which is the nastiest thing that can happen to your feet. Here's some images just so you're aware. So just like I said, this boot was designed to allow water to escape, and the way that is done is by these little ports that have little holes in them to allow the water to escape. So obviously it allows water in, but more importantly, it allows that water to eventually drain out and allows the air to circulate through the boot, eventually drying it out. They also upgraded the lugs on this boot compared to the World War II boot that had that diamond pattern on it. Initially, they started using this Vibram lugged sole that was actually developed in World War II, but didn't ever actually see any use or combat until Vietnam. And the goal of this more aggressive outsole was to be able to grip better in wet conditions, in mud and water and slippery conditions. But the problem was the mud really got caked on there, and once you had a thick layer of mud on top of there, these might as well be ice skates. So they developed an even heavier lug sole that is significantly thicker lugs and more gaps between and more angles. And since we have both outsoles, we ran a couple tests just to see if this really does make a difference. And as you can see, the newer, thicker lugs were significantly better than these tighter lugs. The next thing that they improved is right there on the tongue. It says spike protective, because the initial batch of these didn't have any way to protect yourself against spike, especially the pungy stake traps where they sharpen bamboo sticks and you fall down and it would pierce through your sole, causing you to be out of the war because you can't really fight a war in wet climates with giant wounds in your feet. So what they did with this boot, in order to prevent that, is they basically just put a steel slab of sheet metal through the midsole, so that if you did step on something really sharp, it would at least have to go through a piece of metal to get to your foot, which is pretty unlikely. But to put it to the test, we put it on our puncture test, and to put it in perspective, this is how most boots do when it comes to puncture tests. But when we put the Jungle Boot on there, it took an astounding 306.5 pounds to pierce through the outsole, through that steel plate, and all the way to the inside of the boot. The next thing they did to improve this boot is include a pamphlet that gives you instructions on how to wear the boots, how to size the boots, how to care for the boots. And one of the more interesting things that is a common mistake for anyone that has leather boots is how to dry your boots. Tropical climate, wet boots, it's important to know how to dry them. A lot of people, as soon as they get their boots wet, they put them right next to the heater. It overheats the leather, it dries it out really quick, causing them to be really fragile and crack. And as you can see, that's what happened with this leather that we did that to. So don't dry your boots next to a heater. The next thing is the canvas. So they obviously use canvas to make it a little bit more lightweight, more breathable, more flexible. less hot, and the initial run was done with cotton canvas. But the problem with cotton is the more you get it wet, the more it stays wet, it starts to rot, it starts to disintegrate and break down. So eventually they moved to a nylon upper, which is what this one is because we ran a quick flame test on it. And you can always tell the difference between cotton and nylon because of the way it smells. Nylon smells a lot more plasticky, cotton just smells like you're burning wood. And nylon melts when you put it to flame and it creates a hard plasticky sheen on top. And one really cool thing that I didn't know before this video was this nylon strap here is basically just tie-down strap that they added to the boot in the later versions, because another issue with canvas is it's really strong and it's fairly puncture resistant, but where it's sewn to the boot is its weakest point. And so they added this on to give it a little bit more rigidity and a little bit more strength, because as you're walking and you're pulling this, all of that tension goes straight to this nylon tie-down strap. And finally, to the weirdest and probably my most favorite thing that they did to this boot is the insole. So this is a Saran ventilating insole that traps air in it. At least that's what it was designed for. It's because the idea is that this was almost like a sponge, so that when you step down on it, any of the water that's trapped in there will be squished out and hopefully pushed out through these ventilation ports right there. Then as you release that step and your foot starts lifting up, it creates like almost like a bellows, so that there's constant airflow being pushed in and out of your boot, or water being pushed in and out, hopefully mostly out. And it's just 3 or 4 layers of a mesh material. So instead of over designing it and making it super complicated, they just made a very simple solution to it. I don't know if it actually worked or not, but as you can see from the footage, it does absorb and push water out. So it must have worked to some degree. So kind of interesting. And it says do not boil, because it probably shrinks. So that's all the big improvements and features they designed into this boot. But what is the actual quality of this boot? Is it a decent boot? How much leather's in it? Is it as good a quality as the World War II boots? Let's find out and get it cut in half. All right, I got it cut in half semi-successfully, because it clearly is steel plate all the way through it, because my bandsaw was wandering and burning out the blade. But let's see what's inside. I thought for sure that this would be a mostly synthetic boot because of how it's built and the time that it was made. But there's a surprising amount of leather in here, because the lasting board is leather, and then the counter is leather, the counter cover is leather, and the layer underneath of that metal plate that runs the full length of the boot is also leather. And it's kind of interesting how they've made this, because that top layer of leather and the bottom layer of leather sandwich that steel plate, and it's sewn all the way around. And that stitching doesn't go through the outsole, it doesn't even go through the upper. It's just to make that leather and metal sandwich. And so the way they make this boot, what they do is they put that insole sandwich on the last, and they wrap the upper around the last and nail it to the insole. And then finally, the outsole is vulcanized to the insole and the upper, binding all those layers together with the nails. And that's why these boots are so sturdy compared to a cemented construction, because it's vulcanized. It's actually melted and cured into the materials that it's attached to. And the steel plate is surprisingly thin. I thought it was going to be pretty thick, but it's really only less than 1 millimeter thick. And this boot also has a steel shank. And one of the more interesting and odd things that I didn't expect is this block right here is a block of wood. I thought for sure it'd have voids in it, or it'd be a solid piece of rubber, but I think the reason they put wood in there is to cut down on the expense and to cut down on the amount of rubber that was used to make these boots, because they were making them at such high volumes, and maybe to cut down on weight because wood is a little bit lighter than rubber. And as for the other components, the toe stiffener is a cellulose counter. I thought it'd be leather. And then this lining on the inside, if we do a little burn test on that, didn't melt, and it smells like cotton, so it's cotton. And you can now see that this cross section of the leather, you can see the bluing on the inside, which is the telltale sign of a chrome tan leather, which is to be expected for this for a military boot. It's a mass production. But overall, this boot is actually a really high quality boot, especially for the price that you can pick these up for at pretty much any surplus store. I think we got these for like 50 bucks. And these are better than most $200 to $300 boots. Versions of this boot were around up until 2005. You know, they changed a few components here and there, but the base of this boot has been around for 50 years. And I thought for sure this was gonna be a boring video and it's gonna be all synthetic, but it ended up being one of the more interesting videos we've ever done on boots, because it's not a boot designed for what someone thinks consumers want. It's a boot designed over decades. It's a forced evolution of what soldiers, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, needed. And every component in this boot has a purpose and a function, and it was designed solely for function over form. And very rarely do you see this perfect of an example of function over form. So let me know what you guys think and what you thought of this video. I think we're finally gonna do the World War II boot series. It should be all the way through July. And we got another cool military boot coming up. If you've ever seen the bunny boot, they're ridiculous and I'm dying to know what's inside of them. So thank you guys for everything you do. And thanks again to Tactile Turn for sponsoring this video. Check them out below. The pins are sick. Thank you guys. See ya.